I'm going to begin today's lecture by introducing you to some of the features of a generalized worldview of India. A worldview is the sum total of all those assumptions about life that lie so deep in our subconscious that it hardly ever occurs to us to notice them, much less question their validity. Such a worldview accompanies every one of us through life, from the time we're small children learning about the world from our parents and other authority figures, through our growth and development as adolescents and adults, and on until the end of our lives. Every one of us has a worldview. Many of those worldviews are in constant flux, as mine has been, and as I trust yours is, as you learn and grow. And each person's worldview is a little different from that of everyone else. Yet there's enough commonality among the worldviews of people living within a single culture that all the shared components of those individual worldviews could be said to constitute the worldview of the culture itself. To cut directly to the most basic fact of all, the generalized Western worldview is dualistic, while that of India is monistic, a fact that I mentioned in passing during the last lecture. A dualistic worldview is one in which all experience is cleanly divided into this and that, light and darkness, good and evil, God and the universe, I and thou. It is a worldview that has been cultivated, nurtured, and reinforced by mainstream Western philosophy ever since classical Greece by such luminaries as Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and plenty of others. A dualistic worldview has demonstrated its usefulness in the sciences, and there's simply no arguing with the success of science. That must mean that a dualistic worldview is, in some sense, true. As a downside, a Western worldview is essentially alienating, as it places the self apart from the other. It galvanizes us to fight wars of conquest and to exploit others, to regard them not as ends in themselves, but as means to our own ends. It is not a perfect view of the world, which is why utopian schemes based on it so often fail. That dualistic worldview is fundamental to the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. There is an alternative, but it's difficult for those marinated in a dualistic worldview from the time they were small children to understand that alternative. The alternative is monism. That is the way of India, at least since the time of the Upanishads, which, as I mentioned in the last lecture, were written about 2,500 years ago. In a monistic worldview, the world is not so readily divisible into this or that. The division is merely apparent and understood to be arbitrary. There is in reality no clear dividing line between self and other, between God and the world. You are inextricably involved in the world. This worldview is, of course, reflected in the art of India, including its music, and this fact is one of the reasons that I maintain that art is the truest thing there is. It cannot lie. It necessarily reflects the worldview of the person or culture that made it. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony could only have been written in Europe, could only have been written during the early 19th century, and could only have been written by Ludwig van Beethoven. It is impossible to think of more individualistic music. Our words often betray us, by the way. Individual actually means undivided. Yet when we think of ourselves as individuals, we imagine ourselves to be fundamentally separated from all the rest of the herd. The monistic worldview of India is expressed in maxims and greetings. As an example of the former, consider the maxim, neti neti, neither this nor that. That little saying captures the essence of monism. Distinctions are only apparent. An example of the latter is the greeting commonly seen in India that involves hands pressed together at chest level and a shallow bow. There is a word that often accompanies that greeting, Namaste. It's a potent word, and translation into Western language is apparently difficult, considering the great number of attempted translations I've seen. One of the most potent is, "The God that is in me salutes the God that is in you, for they are the same God." In other words, this greeting goes straight to that thing, call it whatever you like, that is the same in all of us. My way of expressing something of the same sentiment is to observe that, whatever our situation in life, however our ways of understanding the world differ, and whatever advantages we've enjoyed or didn't enjoy, we're all in the same boat, all 7.8 billion of us. Ultimately, we will rise or fall together. In Hinduism, there's a pervasive sense that God is the ultimate reality, expressed in the notion of Brahma. All else is simply a manifestation of that one ultimate reality, so while it may seem that our lives are somehow separate from the whole, we in fact have as little independence from that whole as a fleck of foam on the surface of the ocean has from the ocean as a whole. That fleck of foam will soon fall right back into the ocean whence it came and will be absorbed by it, thus losing its apparent individuality, while other flecks will be constantly tossed by that same ocean, all indistinguishable from each other and all ultimately part of the whole. It's not a perfect illustration, but it may be about as close to a description of ultimate reality as we can get. Just as a dualistic worldview is expressed, unavoidably, in Western art, so this monistic worldview finds expression in the art of India. Let's consider the music we heard in my last lecture, Sarasiruha, a hymn to Saraswati. In that performance, we heard some fantastic playing on two instruments, the veena and mridangam. Those complex melodies and rhythmic formulae were all over the place, rising and falling, surging and waning, leaping and gamboling, soaring and swooping, busy, busy, busy like our individual lives, all packed with adventure and heartbreak and triumph and disappointment, all of which we take personally because from that perspective, this is all happening to me. And of course, although we often do everything we can to keep from thinking about it, our individual lives will come to an end, and the adventure will be over. Yet in that performance, the first thing we heard was the shruti, that ubiquitous drone that was present throughout the performance and faded away to nothing at the end, almost as though it were the one real reality of that music, with the implication being that the unchanging, unruffled drone runs like a thread not just through time, but through eternity. Now consider the notion of Brahma, the ultimate eternal reality, out of which all our individual experiences arise and to which they return. No matter how tumultuous our lives, the unchanging reality that lies beneath them is unaffected, remains calm, poised, eternally serene. Brahma is, of course, a name for God, and another saying common in India is, Atma is one with Brahma. So what is Atma? Right now, I need to broach another big subject to which I'll return in a few minutes, mentioning at this point only that many of the modern languages of India are derived from the language of the invading Aryans, the language known as Sanskrit. Many of the words used in modern Hindi are of Sanskrit origin, and here I've used two of them, Atma and Brahma. Sanskrit happens to be one of the older languages in what's called the Indo-European language group. It is related to Latin and Greek, and even to Celtic, in other words, languages associated with Europe. The tale of that relatedness is fascinating, and I'll touch on it in a little while. My point now is that with many Sanskrit words, we can find cognates in languages derived from Latin and Greek, and Atma is one of those words. Atma is cognate with the Greek word atom, which means undivided, or, per my earlier observation, individual. And to work out the connection and get a grasp of what this means, we'll need to consider that the air we breathe is a component of an atmosphere, which includes that same word that we're considering. Stay with me here. Our remote ancestors did not know that we live and move about in a particulate atmosphere, so everything about the air was a mystery. Who could explain what the wind was? We could feel it and see its effects, but could not see the wind itself, which therefore came to be regarded as some kind of spiritual force. Those same ancestors noticed, of course, that humans and animals were constantly breathing, taking that spiritual force again and again into their bodies, and when they died, they stopped breathing. Thus they came to regard the mysterious substance air as the breath of life. One of the Greek words for air is pneuma, spelled with a P, the same word root that is found in pneumonia, a disease of breathing, and the pneumatic tires on your car or motorcycle, tires that you inflate with air. That word pneuma is also the word that is often translated spirit in the Bible. Air was considered a spiritual force. Consider that in Genesis chapter 1 of the Hebrew Bible, translated to Greek and filtered through a Christian lens, the unformed world of the first two verses includes either the Spirit of God moving on the face of the waters, or a wind from God blowing across the face of the waters, depending on which translation you read. That's why in the second creation story of Genesis, which is found in chapter 2, God forms the first human from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. That's why the flood of Noah drowned every living creature in whose nostrils was found the breath of life. I'm quoting now. That's why Elijah ascended to heaven in a whirlwind. That's why Jesus said to Nicodemus, the wind blows wherever it will, and you hear the sound of it, but can't tell where it's coming from or where it's going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. That's why in Acts chapter 2, a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind accompanied the spiritual baptism of the early church. I could go on, but I trust my point is made. So back to that saying, Atma is one with Brahma. You've encountered that word Atma before, perhaps without recognizing it. Do you recall the honorific nickname that was bestowed on the leader of the Indian independence movement during the first half of the 20th century? His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, but people called him the Mahatma. That's Maha plus Atma, great plus soul. In other words, in Western terms, the phrase Atma is one with Brahma is sometimes rendered, the soul is one with God. That's as monistic as monism can get. No clear division between oneself and ultimate reality. That's why the notions of karma and reincarnation exist in the first place. The sense of I returns to the world with every baby born, while the ultimate reality behind all those individual selves is life itself. This is why so many yogis, practitioners of yoga, meditate on the sacred syllable Om. If you sustain that syllable long enough, you can even hear your heartbeat in it. That Om is the hum of the universe, the voice of Brahma. And that's why there's an unchanging drone underlying all of the music in India. The Shruti is, in a sense, the most important part of any musical performance in a culture with this kind of worldview. I hope I've made my points clear. Everything about Indian philosophy is, of course, much deeper and more complex than what I've been able to relate here in a few words, but I do encourage you to look into it. The Upanishads would be a good place to start. That word Upanishad means something like sitting nearby devotedly, a sort of guru to pupil dynamic. And speaking of Sanskrit words and their meaning, let's consider yoga, which is cognate with the English word yoke. A yoke is a device that one lays across the necks of two oxen, effectively combining the individual animals into one pulling force to draw a wagon, for instance. Yoga is a discipline meant to unite us with something, perhaps restore a connection that is easy to lose sight of. Consider the etymology of the word religion. The prefix re means the same in this word as it means in any other word that begins with it, something done over again. The lig part is more interesting. That root is found in such words as ligament and ligature, that is, something that binds two things together. Religion, in its most fundamental meaning, has to do with restoring a connection that has been lost or severed. And I must tell you, I find this deeply ironic, since I can identify no force in the world that is more divisive than religion. Can you? People are more apt to take up arms and kill each other over their conflicting concepts of an undemonstrable abstraction, God, than over almost any other thing. Go figure. There are hundreds of obvious cognates between Sanskrit and the Western languages Latin and Greek, which is what enabled linguists during the 19th century to discover the existence of a family of related languages extending from India to Iceland, the Indo-European language group. I want to give you a couple more examples, and then I'll try to explain how these related languages came to be and what relevance that relatedness has to music. Upon studying the Vedas, those ancient Sanskrit hymns to the gods and goddesses of the Aryans, British scholars in the 1800s found many such cognates, one of the first having to do with a deity known as Deus Pitar. This god is not very well known in the West, but the stories that are told about him in India bear a striking resemblance to some of the stories told of Zeus in Greece or of his Roman counterpart, Jupiter. Do you see how those words are related? Think for a moment about how one would express the phrase God the Father in Latin. That would be Deus Pater. Do you see where I'm going with this? Think about the Greek word for God, theos, as in the discipline devoted to the study of God, theology. Do you see those cognates? They jumped right out at the linguists who study the Vedas. Here's another. The religion of the Aryans, like that of most Bronze and Iron Age cultures, involves sacrificial propitiation of the gods. You sacrifice an animal to placate the wrath of a deity. Of course, if you kill an animal for God, you can't just leave its carcass out there in the field for God to collect it. You have to deliver the goods. This is done, of course, by burning it on an altar dedicated to that gruesome observance. The smoke from the sacrifice rises into the air. Remember what I just told you about air? And is experienced as a sweet odor in the nostrils of God. That's the language of the Hebrew Bible. In the Vedic tradition of the Aryans, a god always attended the burning of the sacrifice, and that god's name was Agni. The GN consonant cluster in that name is cognate with English words that have to do with burning, to ignite, for instance. Ominously enough, the nuclear weapons program of India is codenamed Agni. With atomic bombs, you can set the world on fire. Now I want to make an important point, and then we'll examine how it is that most of Europe, along with India and regions in between, came to speak related languages, the Indo-European language group. That point is this: the music of Europe and India, acoustically speaking, is very similar. The scales that are used in Western music, the 6 diatonic scales I talked about in Lecture 3, are also found among the 72 basic ragas of India, and the other 66 ragas share a great deal in common with those 6 diatonic modes. It seems intriguing to me that Europe and India have not only a linguistic tradition in common, but a musical one as well. How can this be? Here's part of the answer. If you'll look at this map, you'll see that the root stock of the Indo-European languages originated about 8,500 years ago south of the Black Sea, the region known as Anatolia, or Asia Minor, or nowadays Turkey. This region also saw some of the first great building projects, one of which, Göbekli Tepe, dates to about 11,000 years ago. I'll furnish a link in the description below so you can read about it if you like. And the region south of the Black Sea also hosted one of the earliest thriving agricultural enterprises at a time when the Black Sea didn't actually exist. Instead, the Black Sea basin was partly filled by a large freshwater lake, known retrospectively as the Black Sea Lake. There were farming communities all around that vast lake, and everyone was doing just fine in a climate that had only recently warmed, starting with the meltback of the last of the great Pleistocene glaciations about 11,700 years ago. It was that warming that made it possible for people to grow grains. And if you can grow grains, you can store them as a hedge against famine. I've also addressed this in earlier lectures. The thing is, ocean levels, meanwhile, were steadily rising as the continental glaciers continued to melt. And the people around the Black Sea Lake were completely ignorant of that fact. Most of them had never been more than 15 miles away from the place where they were born, and none of them knew that we live on a spherical planet, most of whose surface is covered by salty water. About 7,600 years ago, the water in the worldwide ocean, which of course includes the Mediterranean, so-called because of its apparent position in the middle of the earth, finally rose so high that it burst through what is now the Bosporus Strait, where modern-day Istanbul is situated, and flooded the low-lying Black Sea basin. That salt water was rushing into a formerly freshwater lake at such a rate, roughly 100 Niagara Falls all going off at once, that the formerly friendly lake on which the people had depended for their livelihood began eating its own shoreline at the rate of about a mile a day in every direction. Talk about running for your life. The people around that lake would have scrambled for the nearest high ground, salvaging whatever they could in terms of family and domestic animals. Of course, much of that high ground turned out to be rapidly shrinking islands, and the people and animals on them drowned. Those who did get away, fleeing both west and east, took with them a horrendous tale of a worldwide flood for which they had no scientific explanation because they had no science. If you lack a scientific explanation, you'll come up with a supernatural one, and I believe you probably know the explanation they came up with. It's found in many of the world's ancient texts, including the Bible. Of course, the biblical story of the flood involves the drowning of the entire planet by an angry deity, with the only survivors being a 600-year-old man with his 3 100-year-old sons, their unnamed wives, and a bunch of animals that rode out the flood in a large wooden boat. Keep in mind that that story was not written down until thousands of years after the event itself, because written language has only been available since about 5,000 years ago, long after the cataclysm I've described. It's the kind of story that would have been told by parents to their children, and by those children to theirs in turn, and so on, like a great game of telephone lasting thousands of years. And like any game of telephone, the story grew and grew in the retelling. Stories like the flood story in the Bible often contain a kernel of truth, although the reality was far different from the much later written account. My point here is that both India in the East and Europe in the West share both a linguistic tradition and a musical one, and to judge from what I see on this map, both those traditions must have had a common origin. Consider one more fact, and I believe my point will have been made. Notice that the Indo-European languages did not penetrate Iraq, Syria, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa. In those regions, a number of Semitic and Semitic-derived languages are spoken, with Arabic being the dominant language nowadays. And the music from those regions sounds very different from the music in India and Europe. If you listen to Arabic music, you're going to hear the use of certain partials of the harmonic series that you won't hear in Western music, namely the 7th and 11th partials, if you're interested in looking it up. And if you'll listen to some Arabic music, many examples of which you can find on YouTube, I think you'll notice right away that there's quite a difference in the sound of it from that comes from Europe and India. These kinds of connections between music and language lie very deep, a fact I've already noted several times and to which I want once again to commend your attention. Music and language are so deeply intertwined that there's almost no separating them. We are a musical species. That said, the old platitude, music is a universal language, is clearly nonsense. There is no one universal language. It is only true that the use of language is a phenomenon known to all cultures. Do you see the difference? It is also true, of course, that music making is common to all cultures. But some cultures' music sounds as alien to people living in other cultures as their languages are incomprehensible. Other languages can, however, be learned with enough effort, and the same is true of music. I have only one more point to make in this lecture, and then I'll turn you loose on the quiz of the day. One of the most salient features of Western music is the fact that it modulates. If you paid attention to that commentary I provided along with the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, you saw that although the tonic key of that movement is C minor, the music modulated many times during its unfolding. It began in C minor, it finally returned there, but in the meantime it took a tour of the harmonic universe. The music of India, however, cannot modulate, for the simple reason that it's grounded in an unchanging tonic drone, the Shruti. I mentioned a parallel instance in the music of Native America, which likewise does not modulate, and I tried to show how that more static music reflects the lives of hunter-gatherers who necessarily live within the budget of their established territories and therefore do not build empires. But Europe in the 19th century was very much an empire-building culture and had been for over 3 centuries when Beethoven wrote that symphony. An empire is not content with what it has ready to hand. It sends out military forces to subjugate vulnerable populations elsewhere in order to enslave them and reap the benefits of their lands and labor. The symphonies of Beethoven are, in that sense, expressions of empire, which was central to the worldview of Europe. India never built an empire. India has been subject to several empires, most recently the British Empire, but it never had imperial ambitions itself. And its static, non-modulating music is, in a sense, a reflection of that difference. Art reflects life. It cannot do otherwise. If you want to understand a culture that is different from your own, first go to that culture's art and see if you can figure out what it's trying to tell you.